Plenty for Hobs, written by Sean Putnam, read by the author. It was a waterfall by tradition only. Long ago, the falls and the river they fueled provided fresh water for all creatures of the valley. Fish swam in lazy circles, while dragonflies danced and darted among the tangled mazes of cattail. High among the endless trees, birdsong from a dozen species combined with a rainbow panoply of butterfly wings, endless colors shining in the dappled sunlight. All gone now. The blue sky had turned ashy gray. The trees had burned to twisted stumps, and the waterfall, once a beautiful cascade of life and light, had withered to a steady trickle. The riverbed, now dry most of the year, had become a mud-slicked bog. A line of creatures stretched along the riverbank and up the nearby hill. Rabbits, badgers, beavers, grouped mostly by kind, murmured quietly amongst themselves as they waited for their turn. When they reached the front of the line, they stepped forward, holding whatever vessels they carried under the falling water. They filled bottles, jugs, vases, each in their turn, and when their containers could hold no more, each creature would stand beneath the water, mouth open to catch as much as they could drink. Then the supplicants moved reluctantly away, stopping several times to look back, while the next family of creatures stepped forward to repeat the process. This was the festival of sharing. It came once a month. Eli was short, even for a hob. The armor he'd inherited from his father hung loosely off his rail-thin frame, and his horned helmet often slid down to cover his eyes in a way that surely would have spelled his doom on a battlefield. But there were no battlefields anymore. Eli looked around at his fellow hobs. Each stood between the parapets of Waterfall Keep, gazing down at the twisting line of animals far below them. Mostly they looked bored, though some wore expressions of cruel mirth. These hobs were usually older, and many bore the scars of rabbit claws and badger teeth somewhere along their gray, leathery hides. They were veterans of the war, and they'd developed a thirst for pain which even victory could not slake. So they drank what they could from the misery of the creatures below. This contingent also had a small following of younger hobs, who'd been raised on exaggerated tales of glorious battle against the creatures of the pillaged woods. These young hobs longed for their own days of glory, but since the closest any of them ever got to their foes was here and now, they had to content themselves with petty taunts shouted out into the barren valley. If this proved unsatisfying, they sometimes pissed off the side of the wall into the falling water.
"Aye, have a bit of flavour."
Eli turned. He watched a fat hob snort a thick wad of snotty phlegm into his mouth before gobbing it out into the flow of water. This was Bricko, who was only 2 seasons older than Eli himself, but who styled himself as one of the great boar lancers of old. Bricko's armor was scuffed, telltale marks of battle gouged into its metal, but like Eli, he'd only inherited it from his father. Like Eli, Bricko had hardly ever left Waterfall Keep. Eli doubted if Bricko had even seen a rabbit or beaver up close, but here, high on the walls, bravado came easy, and Bricko's friends rewarded the fat hob's antics with peals of laughter. A burly hob to Eli's right stepped forward and smashed the blunt end of his spear onto the top of Bricko's helmet, producing a loud clang. Bricko's friends began to laugh at this too, but the burly hob snarled at them to shut up. This was Gamby, their commander, and everyone knew that the scuffs and scars on his armor were well earned.
"Knock it off,"
Gamby said, as Bricko rubbed his head through the new dent in his helmet.
"Them down there is keeping the peace, so no sense in stirring 'em up. That is, unless you grubs want to see what the teeth of a beaver can do up close. And if that's the case, I know a shortcut that'll get you down to them in no time."
Before anyone else could speak, a shrill whistle cut through the heavy air and rang off the high stone walls of Waterfall Keep. The assembled hobs began to murmur appreciatively as they collected their spears. Shift change. The feasting hall was full of sound. The brass horns of hob musicians could barely be heard over the noise of 100 conversations, punctuated by fits of raucous laughter. The aroma of roasting meats mixed with the heady scent of wood burning in the large fireplace. Eli took 2 slices of boar meat from the carving table and turned to find a place to sit. He could see Bricko at the head of a table nearby, no doubt telling the story of how his father had been there on the day when the Forestkin's forces had broken for the final time. Eli knew the story by heart, and he was in no mood to hear it again. He found a corner of the room where the acoustics dampened the noise a little. Few Hobs were there, mostly preferring to be in the thick of the revelry. It was a festival day, after all, and the blackberry beer was flowing far more freely than the pitiful waterfall outside. Eli was surprised to see Gamby seated there, with an open spot on the bench beside him. Eli sat down by the older Hob. Gamby didn't look at him.
"Party's over there, grub."
"No room," Eli said apologetically. Gamby grunted, but he could see well enough that Eli was telling the truth.
"Chew with your mouth closed, then."
Eli cut a sliver of boar meat and brought it to his mouth. Beside him, Gamby sipped his beer. They sat this way for several minutes.
"Knew you da,"
Gamby said at last.
"Fine hob."
Eli said nothing.
"His armor don't fit you."
"Mum says if I keep eating, I'll grow into it," said Eli.
"You'll get fat,"
Gamby said.
"All we've left for you lot is high walls and shit beer. You grubs got nothing but to eat, tell your father's stories, and get fat."
Eli didn't know how to respond, so he forked another piece of meat into his mouth.
"Weren't always so,"
Gamby said, his eyes on the foam swirling in his mug.
"Now the rabbits, they could brew a proper ale."
"They could."
"Oh, aye,"
the old Hob said.
"Taught us a mite on farming, they did."
"Bricko says the Forestkin stole that knowledge from Hobs,"
Eli said.
"Bricko's a pisspot,"
Gamby said.
"I remember things as they was, when the forest was green, and the river flowed from here to the other lands in the south. My granddad was a fisherman."
Eli was surprised. He'd heard stories of fish when he was a baby, but he'd never seen one. A chorus of drunken singing piped up from the center of the hall, Bricko and his coterie bellowing the words to an old Hobbish battle hymn. Eli and Gamby watched as they slurred the lyrics to the opening verse.
"I've never seen a fish,"
Eli said.
"My dad said they all died when we choked off the waterfall. It's how we broke the Forestkin army."
"Aye, glorious day,"
Gamby said. His gaze had gone distant. Meanwhile, Bricko crooned the song's final verse, dragging out the final ululating note to the generous applause of the other Hobs around him.
"I remember how they felt,"
Gamby said suddenly. Eli looked at him.
"What?"
"Fish,"
Gamby said.
"Slimy they was, but strong. Tasty, too. Grandad showed me how to cook them over the fire. He always had scales in his beard."
Eli imagined tangled Hob hair glittering with silver scales. He had little experience with pretty things, but that seemed to be the right word for the picture now in his mind. Gamby took another drink and grimaced at the taste.
"Then we choked the river. Now we Hobs have got as much water as we can stand, and what do we do with it but make shit beer?"
"But we had to win the war."
Gamby slammed his mug down hard on the wooden table, nostrils flaring, eyes flashing with irritation. For a moment, Eli expected to feel the back of the old Hob's hand, but gradually Gamby's expression sagged, and he turned to stare once more into the frothy depths of his mug.
"You grubs was born in this place,"
he said, his voice almost lost against the sound of the revelry around them.
"You don't know the world like it was, when there was plenty."
Eli tilted his head.
"What's plenty?"
"The forest went on forever,"
Gamby continued.
"Food in abundance, and the river. How many kingdoms share in her? Rabbits, beavers, Hobs. We all drank our fill, and she never ran dry. Plenty for all."
Eli tried to imagine it, but found he couldn't. The idea of that much water freely flowing, available to anyone, sounded impossible. A green world full of life, that sounded impossible too.
"But there's them as weren't satisfied with plenty for all,"
Gamby said.
"What if somebody tried to scoop up all that plenty for themselves," they said. Better we done it first, because if we was thinking it, somebody else was too. So we took the river, we took the forests, we kept what we needed, and we burned the rest. Now, what plenty that's left is for Hobs."
From his table at the center of the hall, Bricko suddenly bellowed angrily. Eli watched as Bricko and another burly young hob each grappled over one end of a wooden tray of cheeses. The wedges of cheese spilled onto the floor as Bricko yanked the tray towards himself, then drew it back and smashed the flat end into his rival's face. The other hob fell backwards, black blood flowing from his nose, while the rest of the hobs around the table laughed. Bricko picked up a lump of cheese and rubbed it against his pants before popping the whole thing into his mouth. Gamby, who had also watched this exchange, shook his head.
I wish I could have seen it,"
Eli said quietly.
"The river, the forest, the fish."
Gamby suddenly slammed his mug against the table again.
"And are you not grateful, Grub? Have you no idea what we sacrificed to give you this world?"
Eli started to apologize, but Gamby turned on his seat, seized Eli by the collar of his thin shirt, and lifted him from the bench. The weathered old hob shook Eli roughly with each word. Eli could feel Gamby's hot spittle against his cheeks.
"You think I risked my life to listen to your whinging? You think I got my guts rearranged by badger claws just to hear a feck shot like you tell me it weren't worth it?"
Eli didn't know what to do. He couldn't overpower Gamby, and though he tried to stammer out an explanation, he found the words tangled in his throat. He closed his eyes, waiting for the blow to fall. But Gamby released him. Eli fell back to the wooden bench, smashing his bollocks against the seat. He groaned, reaching down to rub them, as Gamby resumed his seat beside him and took up his drink. He raised it to his lips and took a long pull. Then he turned, and Eli saw that the old hob wore a sad smile.
"Thing is," Gamby said, "I might agree with you."
All around them, the party continued to pulse and swell. When the kegs were drained, more were brought. When the carving table had been cleared, a freshly roasted boar was carried in. Everyone ate and drank their fill. There was plenty. Plenty for Hobs, anyway.